All right, we are live. Hello, everybody. If you're new here, my name is Joanna, or from the channel Joanna Reads, and today we are talking about Guy Gavriel Kay's Tigana. And so I have here with me, I'll start on going clockwise from where I am. The library ladder is here. So hello, Bridger.
Good afternoon, Joanna,
It's so wonderful
and
to have
everybody
you
else
back.
in the. I'm very happy to be back. In fact, this is my first stream since I was on your Y Reads segment back in January.
That's right. So if you all don't know, I have a Y Read discussion series. And yes, Bridger was on my discussion series back in January. It was a fantastic discussion. So you all should check it out after this replay if you haven't seen it already. And then going downwards to Josh from Red Fury Books. Hey, Josh, how's it going?
Hey, I'm great. I'm excited to talk about this. GGK is my favorite new discovery of an author last year, and he is just shooting up my favorite authors of all time list. And this did not, diminish that rise. So I'm really excited to talk about this book.
Absolutely. Yes. And we also have another GGK enthusiast here, which is Jake Bishop. And Jake is the reason that I did not start my Guy Gavriel Kay journey with Tigana.
Yep.
And how's it going, Jake? Maybe you could tell
It's
us
going well.
also why you recommend not starting with Tigana as
I
your
imagine
first.
we're going to
A
talk
book.
about this when it's like when comparing it to the other books, but I think it's just like if I figure I'm giving someone the first book for an author, I want it to be a few things. I want it to be good. I don't want them to read it and then like dislike it because then they're not going to try more things by the author. Tigana meets the good criteria. I also want it to be like kind of representative because I don't want it to be something super different because then if they read it and they really like it and they go buy all the other authors' books and then they read those and don't like it, that kind of sucks. And vice versa, if they read it and they're like, this is good, but I just don't like it. And then they're like, oh, I'm not going to read this author. And then maybe they would have really liked most of the person's books. And I just think it doesn't meet that criteria. I think it has a different tone than a lot of the other books. It's the most fantastical of all of the other books. It has more of like, to me at least, like the characters have more of like a mythic feel. Like so I only reread one chapter for this. I didn't reread the entire book. I only reread the Corn Swords chapter. And some of the dialogue, it was like, this sounds a lot more like dialogue, like internal monologue you'd see in something like Lord of the Rings than like more fantasy that's like where the characters are slightly more grounded. So I just think the characters have a different feel. And also I think Tigana is Guy Gavriel Kay book where you most have to buy into the central premise. It requires the most buy-in. Like Lions of Song is just like there's no big central premise to it. But Tigana, if you read it and you're like, but do they really care about like the memory of the name of Tigana, which some people are like that, you just won't like the book, even if the rest of it is really good because it leans into that premise so much. So even if I think Tigana is wonderful, I think it's not the best place to start for all those reasons.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I know that of the three I've read so far, Tigana has been my least favorite of the three I've read, though I still had so many positive things to say about it, which I know we're going to go in depth about in this discussion. And when I said that in my spoiler-free review, I did have a lot of comments like this. There were several people who said that they loved the book maybe, or that they did have some conflicting opinions. And maybe it speaks to your point about the buy-in part. I mean, that could be one thing among any other things, but I did really appreciate how magic was integrated into this story and how much more magical this was than the other two Guy Gavriel Kay books I've read. And I guess I'll go back to Bridger again. Can you let us know what your thoughts are of Tigana? I know you did a wonderful Guy Gavriel Kay tier ranking list. And just if you want to speak more broadly about Kay's works and your thoughts about Tigana.
Sure, thanks. I'll echo Jake's comments about not starting with Tigana. I agree with everything Jake just said. And I mean, Jake and I might be the only two people on all of BookTube who've actually read everything Kay has written. At least that's what it seems like. It's probably not true in reality, but I know when I first made, I guess I've made 3 videos about Kay, but really only 2 primary ones. and they were very early in my channel's history. I mean, I did an overview of Kay as an author, claiming, in my opinion, that he's the greatest living fantasy author, and I still agree with that claim today, 2 years later, a little over 2 years later. And it was only the 5th video that I had made, or substantive video at that point. And in fact, 3 of those 5 videos were about children's books. So, you know, I didn't know what to expect when I made that video. I just knew that I really wanted to talk about Kay because no one that I was aware of was talking about him. Jake, I wasn't even aware of at the time. I didn't discover Jake until Jake actually commented on my video.
Yeah, I just did my little thing.
And I went, hey, here's another person who likes Kay and has done some, because I think you had made at least 1 or 2 maybe videos
I don't
about
think
specific books.
I think I
Maybe?
was still reading through them, but I'd read most of them. I think I only had a
Yeah.
couple left when you made that video. So I
Right.
hadn't made my my where to start, because I was really unsatisfied. Like if you Google where to start Guy Gavriel Kay, I think it's like a bunch of the articles are written by people who have only read like 2 of the books and are like, they were both good places to start. And I'm like, how do you know what the best place to start is? You've read 2 of 15 novels. Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah, and that was my follow-up Kay video, because I kind of split it into 2. One talking about what a great author he is, and then the second one just kind of taking all of his books that he'd written up to that point and putting them into tiers, not quite ranking them, because within each tier on any given day, I could actually rearrange the order on a tier because they're so good in so many different ways that it's hard to compare them directly. But I think there are some clear, at least from my perspective, delineations between that very, very top tier, the ones I think I called them masterpieces. And then there's a middle tier of outstanding. I mean, these are really, really good books, but they're not masterpieces. They have some flaws that keep them from rising to that level. And then the bottom tier is still very good, amazingly good, compared to a lot of other fantasy that gets written. But in comparison to the other things that he's written, I just felt like they don't quite measure up. And so I love that. I think your point about representativeness of TIGANA is important, because TIGANA was one of the very first novels he wrote. I mean, he wrote his Fiona Var Tapestry trilogy before this one, which I would argue is actually even more fantasy dependent than TIGANA.
When I talk about this book, I just forget about Fiona Var sometimes. So when I said the most fantastical, I mean of his historical books.
Right. But TIGANA, from my perspective, is a bridge. I mean, it's a transitional book for him, because he followed it up, if I remember correctly, with Lines of Al-Rassan.
It was Arbonne and Al-Rassan.
Or was it Arbonne? I couldn't remember which one it was, which is very much historical fantasy. Not that he likes that term. You know, it's historical fiction with a quarter turn to the fantastic.
That's too long of a term, Guy.
I know.
I think a lot of it's just saying
coming from.
Historical fantasy. Wikipedia says that.
I understand where he's coming from when he objects to the term historical fantasy. And TIGANA is straddling that dividing line between them. And at the same time, you know, Fiona Var has some wonderful elements to it, but it also has some significant flaws.
Yeah.
TIGANA is better. I mean, he was still learning, from my perspective, he's still learning his craft at that point, but he's smoothing off some of the rough edges, getting the plotting a little tighter, getting the character work a little more coherent, and incorporating some of the emotional components a little better. They're integrated better into the story, I think, in TIGANA, but they aren't as good as what he did after it. I mean, there are still some significant flaws, and I think this is definitely one of his outstanding works, but this is kind of middle tier.
Yeah,
in my
it's just,
opinion.
it seems like it's just one of these authors that even low tier is still really, really good, and still high tier in fantasy overall. And I think it is interesting to consider publication order, as you were saying. I guess that A Song for Our Bone was after Tigana, and same with Lines of Alrasan.
Yeah,
So
the 3 in order.
yeah, those are all really
Oh.
interesting to consider. And I want to say I don't know if there was a direct reference to Fiona Var. Was there a reference? I thought I
There,
saw Fiona
yeah.
Var
I saw the word in
mentioned.
there. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's
I
a,
think it was
there's,
Finavar. Yeah.
I
Fiona
think
Var.
in the first couple of these, he's like, "What if I keep referencing?" And then he does it less and less. But
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, there is an argument that all of his books are in a shared multiverse.
I wondered
Yeah.
about
And-
that too,
and
because this has two
Fiona
moons.
Var,
2 moons. Yeah.
Mhm.
right? Fiona Var is I don't know. So if you've read Roger Zelazny's Chronicles of Amber, so Amber is the central hub of this multiverse where you have all of these infinite possibilities of different things, different universes, but they're all kind of echoes of one central
Wow.
universe. Or you can look at Shangri-La or some. I mean, there are other in our real Earth history parallels to that. And Fiona Var represents that central truth. This is the real sort of central world. And every other story that is told is at some farther kind of ripple or echo of that central world. But it's a multiverse. And clearly he's doing that in Tigana because he's making reference to Finavar
Yeah.
in it. But he doesn't really do that in his later books. But you can make the case that that's what he's doing.
If I could insert a couple of points, I just want to go ahead and bring up a couple of comments here. Does GGK know Jake exists? Which, by the way, I found out about your channel, Library Ladder, through Jake Bishop. So,
I remember I watched the GGK video and I was like, at the time, I had more subscribers than Bridger, and I was like, he's gonna pass me fast because this is a really good video.
but we're
And then
grateful
he
for
did.
both of your channels and for bringing awareness. And I know Josh has expressed that as well. But I would like to know, and I would also like to hear Josh's thoughts too, because I know, Josh, you've read a couple more GGK books than I have at this point as well. But Secret Sauce, the Storycraft, brought up a really good question here. So if you guys don't love Tigana, I don't even know if I could say I don't love it. It's more like it just isn't quite at the level.
You will know.
And there are things I don't love about
For
it,
all
but
the
I look.
reasons like I gave to start with it, for me, none of them were descriptors of quality. I'm like, I think the central theme requiring that much buy-in does make it somewhat problematic as a first entry. But I think for people who that really works for, it's actually why Tigana is some people's favorite. And usually they'll acknowledge that it's a little rougher around the edges than like some of his later works. But there's a lot of people who just are so encapsulated by that central premise that Tigana ends up being their favorite. And it's probably like my 5th favorite or 6th favorite in like that realm. But I would say I do love Tigana. I just love like a few others more. And those elements of why I think you shouldn't start with it are not reflections of my own love for it.
And Whitney, I'd add to what Jake said that I think there are elements in Tigana that are potentially polarizing, whereas some of his other books don't run quite the same risks that Tigana does. I mean, there's certain character elements, certain plot elements in Tigana, and I'm trying to avoid spoilers, but they can be very negative for certain types of readers who are very sensitive to certain themes, certain actions, certain situations, and may get really turned off by it. And so as an entry point, you don't really want to start someone off on a more high risk type of book. I mean, it's high risk, high reward. It's a very rewarding read. And so when I criticize it, I'm not saying it's a bad book at all. I think it's a wonderful book, but it's not going to resonate with certain types of readers. I mean, it's really not. And I think there are other books, and I think Jake and I agree pretty closely on this as well, for ones that are pretty good entry points, whether it's A Song for Arbonne, whether it's A Brightness Long Ago. I mean, those two in particular, I think, are the smoothest entry points. I think Lines of Alrasan is also a good entry point. I mean, those are the ones that I think are great. I I hesitate to recommend Lions of Al-Rasan as the best entry point because now my rankings are potentially fluid at that top tier, but I hate recommending that people start at the top
No.
because from that point on, maybe everything else they read isn't going to quite measure up.
So for me, the top is Lord of Emperors, so I can't get people to start at the top because it's book 2. So
I would love to hear Josh's thoughts too. I'm sorry we haven't included you enough, Josh, yet, but I would love to hear your thoughts.
It's all good.
because-
We got 2 experts like here and here. But no, I mean, I'm only slightly ahead of you, Joanna, and just this Guy Gavriel K journey. This was my 5th of his, and we've read and talked about 3 of them together now. And I've also read Under Heaven and River of Stars. And just thinking of it as a kind of a tier ranking, I kind of have. I mean, Song for Arbonne is like a favorite book of all time for me now, but it's up there with Lions and Under Heaven. And then I kind of see River of Stars and TIGANA just kind of a cut below. But kind of what we've all been saying here, it's a cut below for this author. It's not a cut below when you compare him to others, because it's just, his writing is just remarkable. And I think, Jake, when we were talking about Song for Arbonne, you said something that stuck with me. It just said that it's kind of ridiculous that he's good at kind of everything that an author needs to be able to do well. You know, it's perfectly plotted. The world building is frankly the best that I've probably read in this genre. The writing style is just sublime, and his characterization is fantastic. So when we say this is maybe a cut below the others and not the best entry point, I think it's just, yeah, it's a cut below his own high standards. It's not a cut below the other things you'd see in the fantasy genre.
kind of annoying how good he is at writing like duels and battles as well. Like, let other people have some stuff, guy. Like, come on.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
he can flex all of those muscles really, really well, and he can write poetry in his works that are just incredibly beautiful. But I had been wondering about why TIGANA was seems like that's his most famous work. And I wonder if maybe it was his breakout work. I don't know enough of his history, if maybe that's the case, and that's why it's his most famous work.
Now it steals the spotlight from everything else.
Exactly. And that it was his breakout work.
Okay.
It was one of the few of his that actually was nominated for any awards. That is one of the big crimes of kind of literary award giving in the science fiction and fantasy arena, that he hasn't been nominated more or even won any awards. But TIGANA was one of the ones that got a lot of attention early on. And because at that time, again, 1990, I think it was published sometime right around then, maybe 89, there really wasn't a lot that was being written in this style that sort of combined the literary excellence with, you know, the thematic depth. I mean, you had some, yeah. I mean, Tad Williams was starting to explore in a little more depth the kind of world building and character development that an awful lot of fantasy authors prior to then hadn't really done. And so for Kay to just unabashedly say, I'm going to write, a fantasy novel that's going to make people feel. I mean, that's his goal. He wants to make people feel with his writing. It's not about getting people, people's adrenaline pumping, like, oh, that's an exciting scene, or, wow, that was just a fascinating kind of fantasy world that he created here. It's, I want you to feel these characters. I want you to feel the emotions that they're experiencing. I want it to be visceral in a really, really powerful way. And that really resonated with a certain segment of fantasy readers at that time. I wouldn't say a majority of fantasy readers at that time, but certainly a very, I guess a segment that then went on to kind of proselytize Kay to other people. And so TIGANA kind of had this mythic status that for this type of story, this is the one. This is the best that had ever been written up to that point, which arguably may or may not be true, but it certainly had that reputation at the time.
Hmm.
It has now been surpassed, certainly by Kay himself and his own writing. But that reputation for the impact it had 30, 35 years ago still holds true. And it's still his best known work, which is a real shame.
Yes.
There
And
seems like, do you know how many people I know? Shad, I know you're watching this, who read Tigana like 20 years ago and were like, loved it, and then haven't read anything else by him. And I'm like, why did you stop? Please. No. What were you going to say, John?
I also wonder too, I like what you were saying about that time and how much timing plays a role with book sales too. I mean, even thinking of Lord of the Rings, the success of that due to its timing, there's so much story behind that. But as Rin says here, it's an out and out fantasy novel. Hard to sell his later books as fantasy to typical fantasy readers. So I think maybe ticking the genre box could be. I know that's something publishers love.
A
That
lot of
could
people,
be.
I think, who read Tigana are like, oh, but I think a lot of people are under the impression that his other books are actually just like historical fiction. Like, I've seen reviews that are like, this isn't fantasy, this is historical fiction. I'm like, there's 2 moons, dog.
Yeah, right.
Pretty sure, like
Literally the
I was
first sentence.
like, I was
the first
not for
sentence says
Tigana,
there's 2 moons.
But
Yeah,
like,
no,
I've seen
for
people have
Tigana, though?
other novels, I've seen reviews that are like, Lions is unlike Tigana, is like historical fiction. I'm like, I know there's not a lot of magic, but the 2 moons was probably a subtle hint you're not on Earth. Like, just
Yeah.
Right. I mean, some of
Yeah.
his books have ghosts in them. Granted,
Yeah.
they're not playing, really, really significant roles in the book, but they're there. And you have others where you have divine intervention.
I think Lions
And
is the least.
but it's done kind of on the periphery of the story, but it has an impact, but it's not the central focus of the story. I know on my GGK videos, I had quite a few commenters basically try to argue with me. This isn't fantasy. This is historical fiction. Because he's borrowing plot lines from from history. To
My
which,
favorite historical fiction series, by that definition, is A Song of Ice and Fire.
Yeah.
well, here's an
yeah.
even better one, maybe. Dandelion Dynasty
Yeah,
is
a lot more direct.
straight up. I mean, at least certainly
Book
the
one.
first book,
Yep.
book 1 is straight up adaptation of Chinese history.
Yep.
And yet nobody's trying to really, or maybe very, very few people are arguing, well, that's not fantasy.
Although, funnily enough, there's a review of Grace of Kings that tilts me every time. That's like, it starts off, it's like paragraphs of like, this is 1 star because it's like plagiarism. And it acts like it's plagiarizing another book. And then like 3 paragraphs into the review where you're like, it's plagiarizing history. And I'm like, wait until this person hears about Guy Gavriel Kay. They are going to be pissed.
Yeah. I also want to highlight what Jared is saying here about Sanderson talking up Tigana, because I've heard that as well. I've heard Sanderson talk about Tigana as well. And various authors, modern authors these days, talk about Tigana. That I think I think I actually heard Sanderson say something along those lines. He was saying that that Guy Gavriel Kay is a writer's writer, that people who love to write have a tremendous amount of respect for what Guy Gavriel Kay has done.
He's your favorite
I would also
favorite author.
Yeah, and I would also say Sanderson is of an age where probably his first introduction to Kay was through Tigana, and maybe not quite in 1990, but probably not too long after that. And so for him, he would have experienced some of that impact that I described a few minutes ago of like going, wow, this is unlike anything else that I've read before, because there really wasn't a lot being written a lot like that. And so that primacy effect, that this is his first experience with it, is going to make it feel so much better than the others. And I understand that, because I kind of feel the same way about Lions of Al-Rasan. I have it at the top of my own personal ranking, but the last time I read it was probably 20 years ago. And it was one of the early ones that I read of Kay's. And so I'm wondering, is it really my top at this point? If I were to reread it, maybe not. I mean, I'm in the middle of reading Dandelion Dynasty right now. I'm through book 2, and reading Dandelion Dynasty is, and I will say, I am enjoying it. So what I'm going to say about Ken Liu's book and series isn't, I'm not trying to throw shade on it. I'm really not. I am enjoying it. I think it's absolutely deserving of high praise. But I can't help comparing it to Under Heaven. I mean, Dandelion Dynasty and Under Heaven have an awful lot in common. I mean, they are historical fantasies. I mean, they are very much inspired by real historical events. The magic in them isn't front and center. I mean, there's probably more in Dandelion Dynasty. You've got, more divine intervention taking place.
How far are you into Wall of Storms?
I finished.
Okay.
I'm through the first 2 books.
Okay, done the first. Okay.
And yet, Dandelion Dynasty, despite all of the similarities between the 2 of them, feels very much inferior. And that is not at all, I'm not throwing shade on Dandelion Dynasty. I think it's excellent, what I've read of it so far. I'm very much enjoying it. But what Kay does in Under Heaven, in the character work, in the emotional impact, where you actually feel for the characters. There are things that happen in Dandelion Dynasty to the characters, and I like the characters, and I want to feel for those characters when good things happen, when bad things happen. But I'm not getting that gut punch that I get when I read Kay and when I read what happens in Under Heaven. And as I'm reading Dandelion Dynasty, I'm reevaluating my reaction to Under Heaven when I read it a few years ago. I put Under Heaven in my masterpiece tier, but I had it, I think, 4th in the masterpiece tier. If there is a book that might actually jump up to 1st in that tier, it might be Under Heaven, just based on how I'm reevaluating it in the context of reading Dandelion Dynasty.
Interesting.
I'm seeing Under Heaven differently, because they do so many of the same things, but Under Heaven does certain things substantially better.
Yeah, this is certainly one of the challenges when it comes to ranking things, is we always have recency bias, and then we don't, but we also have to reevaluate things with things that we've read more recently. I think that there's a lot to be said with that. I can say, though, that I think that The Lions of Aurison, even though we're not talking about that book, that's not the focus of this discussion, I think that book has aged incredibly well, in my opinion, because I just read it for the first time last year, as did Josh, and I just loved it. Same with The Song for a Bone. But let's go ahead and pivot to talk about TIGANA a little bit more in depth here. And we're 28 minutes in, and we still haven't even given any spoilers, which I think is great.
Great.
But I mean, either way, if we want to go into spoilers or not, I would just love to hear your all's thoughts about the themes. I did talk about a few in my video the other day, but I know there's a lot more that could be said about the themes. And for me, as a theme-driven reader, that's where I feel like the emotion gets me the most with Kay. Not only does he set up really powerful character moments and gut punches and action scenes and magic and so many elements, cultural touches, you name it. But I feel like when I'm most emotional when I read Kay, it's because he's speaking about something that's like broad in the human condition. When he's speaking about the need to be free from tyrants, about freedom, or when we're going into complexity of compassion and looking at vengeance and history and all these things coming together and colliding into a single moment and single action and single revelation. It's really what gets to me personally when I read TIGANA. It's what got to me personally when I read TIGANA. So I would just love to hear other things that you all have to say about the themes. And Josh, I'll invite you to start with this.
Well, you touched upon one of the biggest ones of memory. Something I did with this book that I don't do very often is, after I finished it, I went back and reread the prologue. Because when I read the prologue, I was just absolutely blown away. I think it was the first comment I put on our thread on the fireside. I just said, Kay just can flat out write a prologue. But I went back to it, and the theme of memory, we all read the afterword that he talks about how that was such an important aspect of the story he wanted to tell. And as Jake alluded to, that's kind of the deal breaker, whether or not you buy in with the story, which I did. But I hadn't noticed until I went back to the prologue how the scene with the prince and the sculptor, how it's addressed. And he says, even though we're basically, bad paraphrasing here, we're going to lose this battle tomorrow, people will remember us, and they will remember us for days, and that we held up to tyranny. And then this whole book is about how they were forgotten. And it kind of hit me really hard when I read that. And I think it just lends to Kay's craft to being able to do that, just weave all those elements together. That two little lines, excuse me, that were in the prologue were basically one of the biggest themes in the entire book. And that was the one that really hit me. As far as that theme itself, I connected right away. I really, really like that, because, a lot of times in any kind of work of, art, literature, music, legacy is important. I had just recently read a biography of the composer Johannes Brahms, and as he got to the advanced years, he started burning all his correspondence because he didn't want to have anything negative in his legacies. And, I think about that, and I think of that scene, how they just wanted to make sure that they were remembered. And then what does Brandon do after his son's killed? He just makes sure that nobody remembers TIGANA. Like, wow, just such power.
Yes. That prologue for me, it was one of my favorite prologues I've ever read. And I actually went back and reread it before I even finished the book, because I just kept on going back to it. And I even from the first line of the prologue, it just captivated me with the atmosphere and the moons and the Diza River, but also the subtext between those two characters, as you said, the sculptor and the prince, because I felt as though the prince had lost hope at that point, and he was questioning his actions. He was questioning, did we do the right thing? Because we killed the cub, so to speak. Did we destroy things for everyone in doing that? And I felt his regret. I felt his melancholy feelings about what he had done, and I felt his friend contrasting him and saying, "You did the right thing. Of course, you did the right thing. We have to hold on to our pride." And then the prince saying, our pride. And this talk about pride and question about it was really something that stuck with me, as well as the way that they loved each other. Even though they had contrasting feelings about what was going on, it seemed like the prince was losing hope and his friend was trying to hold on to it and speak to that theme of legacy, as you mentioned, Josh. And they will remember us. The later generations will remember us. It's heartbreaking to look back at that conversation and to see that they don't know what's ahead. And to see how that shapes things moving forward. And it also points to a lot of moral ambiguity, I think, that comes up in this story, which also touched me as well, or also had me very intrigued. So yeah, I love that prologue so much. And I know somebody mentioned, Max Garfield mentioned, I have not watched it, honestly. I still need to watch it. But I know a Critical Dragon did a huge analysis of that prologue, and I'm sure he had a lot to say.
Am I still slightly bitter that he's done a TIGANA GGK video and no other GGK book, because TIGANA always steals the spotlight? Maybe a little bit. Maybe a little bit, but it's a very good video.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead. Either one of you. Jake, do you want to talk about themes?
Yeah, I remember a little bit into this book, obviously the theme being like the importance of memory. I was really impressed with how it resolved in the back half, because I remember at one point reading this book, like the characters, the Tiganans, this is very, very important to them, obviously. And I was at times, like, I being the reader, this was my first Guy Gavriel K book, ironically, because no one told me otherwise. I was like, I feel like this is going too far. Like, they're holding this above everything else. And felt like the book was going too far. And I think it pivoted at the end and really made it a lot more nuanced. where it made you realize like this was intentional with, I actually forget his name because I read this book too long ago, but like Dianora's
Shelto, I think is his
Oh, the
Shelto.
eunuch.
name.
Yeah.
Like he has some bits in this book, and getting his internal monologue really, I think, granted so much perspective. And he's talked about like also the, you know, the dangers of holding it too much as like too important and putting it too much on a oh, what's Eric saying no to?
I don't know.
I didn't accidentally spoil something, right? I don't think I did. I don't think it's a spoiler to say that someone had a perspective shift. Hi Eric. Please tell me why I made you panic. But oh, he hated the ending.
Oh, really?
Oh,
I'm surprised by that hot take,
Oh,
but well, I
loved
guess should we go ahead and I guess we'll go ahead and pivot into spoilers just in case. Just in case we don't want to accidentally spoil anything. So spoilers from now on. Go on.
Okay, so now I can talk about the ending. I love the ending. I don't think Kay's messed up an ending as far as I can remember. He should do that once, just give it a try. But I thought like when Shelto didn't tell them who like the jester was, that he was the previous king, that was kind of a demonstration that they would have then held it too much. And also I love that Alison is a little bit of a hypocrite in that he has a specific comment where he's like, you have to give people credit when it comes to like the emotions that parents feel towards their child. And he never once considers this from Brandon of your Graph's perspective. Like at no point does he consider why Brandon's angry, or like he just considers him like this dude's evil, which obviously Brandon does some really horrible things. But also Alison is really good at considering the perspective of people who are doing horrible things in order to protect their children or because they care about their children, and never considers this for, as far as we can tell. We don't get an Alison POV, I think, but as far as we can tell for Brandon. And I think that bit of hypocrisy and oversight adds to his character and the story in general.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. Library ladder.
I think the themes are what make this book. I mean, this might be the most thematically rich book of all of Kay's. And I mean, it certainly ranks up there in terms of themes. I mean, I could count on all 10 of my fingers and still not cover all of the themes in this book. And one of the things that Kay does so well, I think, is for many of the themes, he introduces them very subtly. I mean, obviously, memory is an obvious theme that's not subtle in this book. I mean, it's right out there in the whole premise of the book. You know, memory has been wiped away. Memory of TIGANA. You know, the identity of TIGANA has been wiped away. Those things, pretty obvious themes. Some of the things that there's some nuance though in there. So for us, just take memory, for example. There are kind of competing ideas that Kay plays with in this book, and I don't think necessarily chooses one over the other. He's sort of throwing them out there and you can explore it. So, you know, the memory theme encompasses the idea of living in the past, because there are characters in this book who are trapped in the past. I mean, their conception of TIGANA is a past conception of what it used to be, and they want to recreate what it used to be, make TIGANA great again. You know, that's that kind of mindset. But there's also a competing idea of memory, which is how can we use memory to live for the future? I think you touched on this a bit in your TIGANA review video, Johanna, when you talk about renewal, that, you know, memory, you know, when you have springtime, that's biological memory. You know, the life cycle of plants, of animals, things like that, that's a form of renewal, but it's also a form of memory. There's genetic memory. There are other, you know, epigenetic memories. There are other things out there. And from a literary standpoint, I think that's the idea that Kay is also trying to put out there, is that memory can be a foundation on which you build for the future, as opposed to regressing back to the past. But he pursues both of those ideas in parallel, because you have different characters who are prioritizing those different ideas in different ways. Does
Yeah,
that make sense?
absolutely. No, it absolutely made sense. That was something that I felt came out quite a bit in this book, actually. And yeah, I mean, I think what was I going to say about memory? Memory is interesting in this book too, because usually when I see the theme of memory come up in books, it takes on a very personal context. It's like the memory of a loved one or a personal journey. And in this book, we're talking about the memory of an entire land. And there's also a question about if a province, if a land can be lost, does it have a soul? Can it die? But also what you're saying too about trying to bring it back the way it was. In a way, a lot of this is Alison's dream. It's Alison's dream, and it becomes Barrett's dream as well with this crusade that's growing. And one thing that I thought about a lot while reading this book is the perspective of Catriona. Yes, I mean, she is living this dream partly because of her father. Her father chose, in her view, to be a coward and not fight this war even before it began or before it was won. And she wants to fight for Tigana, but also Devon, because Devon really he doesn't have any memory of Tigana. As someone who has an impeccable memory, as someone who remembers every detail, he doesn't have a memory of it. So it feels as though they're kind of going off Alison's dream. And in addition to that, it was interesting to get Sandre's perspective in the beginning, because Tigana didn't have the best reputation all around, it seemed. I know from Sandre's perspective, he was mocking the fact that that the Tiganese, that they called themselves princes and princesses and not dukes, that they saw themselves as above everything else. And I thought it would have been easy to think, okay, is this for arrogant purposes to rise up Tigana to be this, to be above everything else? And yet I feel like the cause became bigger than that, as I explained in the review. It seemed like at first it started out as this dream, as almost just Alison's dream to bring back this land. But then the cause became bigger as this idea of freeing the entire peninsula from not just one tyrant, the tyrant who caused the mess for Tigana, but both tyrants, and to try to find a balance when it comes to this power. So I found that theme, again, not overly, like you said, I don't feel like the themes are too on the nose, but they are there. They do blossom forth in the story. And I thought that was pretty incredible, just to think back on the beginning where we started and those perceptions of Tigana, and then where we ended up.
I like Mac has a great comment in the thread there about how many people feel that he's basing their history off their own. I mean, you think of all the different ethnic groups that get enveloped through the years and become part of greater things, how they try to hold on to their own identities. And I think that was quite obvious. I was thinking of like Czechoslovakia, how like in Eastern Europe particular, you see a lot of that throughout history. So I think that's a really good comment there, because I think that's very true. Probably a lot of people do put their own ethnic heritage into lower court / Tigana, you know.
That's why it's a made up place, right? Because if it was about, that's one of the reasons that like he has a bunch of, like, GGK's written a bunch of stuff on like why fantasy and why he does fantasy. And one of, I think, the best examples of like Tigana being a novel that doesn't work as well if it's not a fantasy novel. Like you can't write like the way approaching this from the perspective of a fantasy novel just lets you tackle this theme in a different way, other than the fact that you can't magically erase the memory of people if it's not fantasy. Is that if he wrote this about like a specific place, then it's about that specific one. And he always, like he said he always tells people in that like, yes, it is about like your country, it's just also about all the other times this happened.
It's funny, Josh, that you mentioned Czechoslovakia. So I think Kay has written that the inspiration for Tigana, the book, was a photograph, actually a couple of photographs that he saw of the Prague Spring in 1968, when there was a revolution sort of to liberate Czechoslovakia from the Iron Curtain. And for a brief period of time, they had a degree of freedom. And the photographs that he saw were sort of this before and after, where there was a photograph of, I think it was maybe the Prague Chamber of Commerce or some business group there. And it was, 8, 10, I don't know exactly how many. I looked online to try and find this photograph, see if I could show it here, and I couldn't find it. So I'm not exactly sure what it looks like, but apparently it's just this gathering of prominent community leaders in Prague circa 1968. And after that brief revolution was basically stomped down by the Soviet Union, and it was reintegrated back into the Iron Curtain, that photograph was altered by the communist regime because one of the people in that photograph was one of the rebels. And so what they did, and this is long before Photoshop existed, I mean, they actually had to work hard to really carefully replace a person in this photograph with a plant, literally a plant. So that person no longer existed. The historical record, the photograph was still there. It's just one part of it had been excised very carefully. And for any future generations who might look back on that photograph, the person who used to be in that photo no longer existed. They had been erased. That was the genesis of this idea for erasing the identity of an entire country of Tigana.
Wow.
Wow.
And when he talks about the identity in the book, because identity is another one of those big themes here.
Mm-hmm.
It's partly, asking the question, what actually defines us? There are those types of questions that are posed directly and indirectly in the book. What defines culture? Is that really what is the defining feature, or there's some other things that we can point to? He addresses the idea of assimilation. How do people from different cultures fit into environments where they're not, it's not their native land. It's not, or maybe it is their native land, but someone has come in and taken it from them. Then you have the retribution aspect of it, that and the Czech photos is kind of an illustration of that. And then there's the whole concept of diasporas, that what happened to the residents of Tigana? Now, many of them probably stayed in, lower Corte, but many of them went elsewhere. And how does that change that sense of identity? And there's a long historical record in our history of all kinds of diasporas, and how some of them are able to retain strong sense of identity, some not so much, some are completely subsumed by other cultures. And one of the things that comes to mind, I mean, we have it in our own country. I mean, the Native American population here in the US, it wasn't that long ago that let's say in Alaska, you had Mount McKinley that was changed. The name was changed. This was 10 years ago, something. I mean, sometime not that long ago. It was changed back to its original native name, Denali. But that was after decades of effort on the behalf of the native populations in Alaska to say, we want our name back. We want the identity of this very sacred ground. We want to reclaim it. Why should it be called Mount McKinley when McKinley did absolutely nothing here? And there are lots of examples of that, I think, throughout history. And you can find those parallels in TIGANA very easily, which goes to the point that Max Garfield made, is that you can easily project yourself as a reader onto that type of a theme, because to some extent we are all part of some kind of either group identity or diaspora or other. And yeah, it's a very malleable text in that respect.
Wow. That was an excellent example. Those were excellent examples. Yeah. Great.
It's good that we brought a real expert to this one.
I know.
You know?
I love the real world examples, though. I think that just brings more, obviously, that brings a lot more weight to the themes that Kay was presenting. And I think he did it very well in this book.
Well, want me to go more? I mean, like I said, I've got about 10 or 12 themes that I could go into. But I will leave it up to you all whether or not we want to go into all of them.
I have one question for you, Bridger. What do you think of the Corn Swords chapter?
Yeah, that's a good. Yeah.
So this is the only chapter I reread before this, because a lot of time people react to it because it's like, what the crap was that chapter? And I remember being like, what the crap was that chapter? That was awesome. And then I reread it and I was like, yep, still great. And I reread it for this, and I stand by my love for the Corn Sword chapter. And I want to know who in the chat and here is on Team Corn Swords.
Can I be Team Corn Swords, but think the chapter was a little long? Because I like the chapter and I like the ramifications of the chapter.
You can be on that team, but
Yeah.
you're on a different team than me.
Okay, I'll give you my quick thoughts on Team Corn Sword, or the Corn Sword chapter. I thought the Corn Swords were a bit corny.
By definition, one could say.
And it was hard. I tried really hard. And I don't think you helped, by the way, posting pictures of corn in Discord. But I did love some things I did enjoy about that chapter. I did enjoy the green moonlight. I thought that was a neat touch. And I also actually appreciated the end of that chapter too. Even though it was a bit of an insta-love moment between Baird and Elena, I thought that it worked really well, because I thought that was the scene I was talking about in my spoiler-free review that I felt went into that theme of renewal. That was one of them. I think another one, there are a few others, but specifically that one, especially with the flowers reemerging on the hillside. So, and there were interesting things that happened in that chapter. I think that chapter was interesting. So I'll say that there were interesting things, especially as the people saw different enemies than Baird did.
I like that. Yeah.
And that's the important thing for that chapter, is you can't take it literally. I mean, you cannot read it as a literal representation of, what's happening. It's all figurative. It's all representational.
So are you saying they weren't really corn swords?
I choose to believe they were.
I am saying they really weren't corn swords. That is what so I like the chapter, but I also agree with Josh. It's too long. I am going to disagree with you, Joanna. I didn't like the love pairing at the end of it. Not to say that they don't make a good pair, but rather I thought it felt very forced. I really
that's fair. It's very insta love.
Yeah, and well, that's actually a criticism I have for just about all of the romantic relationships in this book. It's one of the failings of the book, in my opinion.
Yes.
But we can get to that later.
Yeah, we can talk about that later. I have a lot to say about those things. Sure.
He does it a little in Fiona Var and then grows out of it a little after.
But I liked.
I mean,
Johanna, what you were saying about the flowers blooming on the hillside. Great imagery. And what it represents can represent a lot of different things. It could be representing, the blossoming of romantic feelings between Baird and Elena. It can be, the revival of the whether it's hope for the future of TIGANA, or just the diminishment of the impact of this, the very hateful sorcery of Brandon that has been imposed on the land. I mean, all of these things could be represented by that, flower imagery. but Kay does it very, very well, I think. But like I said, as Josh said, it went on too long. I mean,
Pretty long chapter. But
it could have been shortened and felt less like going off on a tangent. I mean, and
Yeah.
it could have felt more integral to the story.
it was definitely very tangential. Like, it was a tangent for sure. So there's a few things I really like about the chapter, other than just like the imagery and that, like, the writing. This happens every time I read a GGK chapter in like isolation, because when you read 15 back to back, you get kind of like numb to like how good the writing is. But when I just read one chapter, I'm like, God damn, like every sentence. But that aside, that's slightly cheating because I only read one TIGANA chapter here. I really like how it continues on kind of the theme of how this place under tyranny has fundamentally broken the palm and like its outbranching impacts. And I like how we see that in this case made literal. I mean, this entire Corinth sword thing is a metaphoric. I don't know if it's literal or not, in like Brandon causing like this greater conflict to be more dire, and causing like aiding evil. I also just think like Beard, like the part where Elena just like heard Beard and like recognized like the sense of recognition. It's the first time they get the recognition from someone who isn't Tiganan, like in this book, and it hits for me, like the way it's written when he's kind of like, wait, could you hear my name? And I also love that that's from Elena's perspective, and you can tell Beard is trying to hold it in, like if it had been from his perspective, but Elena kind of recognizes that, but doesn't really, because she doesn't know what's going on. And then also I was just like, ooh, that was badass. That's my last final contribution to why I like the chapter, and that was epic.
Do you think? Sorry, so good.
Aside from like also the stuff you guys said about like the renewal. Anyway, what were you gonna ask?
No, I was going to ask. I mean, so I was having a little bit of a struggle to understand how that was related to the larger story, as you were saying it was tangential, but I wondered if it was somehow related to because we were talking about like what Bridger was saying about lands and about identities, cultural identities being lost, or being rewritten or brushed over. But I also wonder too about religion, because there's also a lot of talk in this story. There's some talk about the triad religion that has taken over, and it seemed to, in my mind, I thought maybe the triad, along with the tyrants, because it seemed like they were complicit with one another, maybe we're also brushing over this foreign sword religion, I guess, or the religion of that land. I don't know if that was the right, if that's an accurate interpretation or not, but I'm going to go ahead and let Max Garfield say something here. The Corin Sword chapter is 90% based on text, Night Battles by Italian history. Okay, yeah. It was claimed to have happened. Okay.
Corin Swords.
All right. I'm sorry.
fact.
I should have read that out loud. I am repeating my video, but the Corin Sword chapter is 90% based on a text, Night Battles by Italian historian Carlo Ginzburg, on a 16th century trial where this claimed to have happened. I'm sorry. The print is very small, so I hope I read that correctly. But interesting.
So, wait, it's a trial where this claim to happen. Was this person like, was this their legal defense? Like, Your Honor, actually, I was using Corin Swords to defend the concept of spring and renewal from the apple. So I had a good reason.
I think this was a heresy trial, if I remember correctly, and so you had this sect of people who believed, certain supernatural things were real, and I think, if I'm remembering correctly, it's been a while. I think there were certain people, if you were born with a call, for example, I think that was an indication that you were blessed by, within this particular sect, that you were blessed with a certain extra sight or ability to interact with another plane of existence. And, the regular church didn't really agree with that. But you had this very isolated community that did believe it, and they tried to keep it secret and acted on it. Max Garfield, am I getting that right?
That was my interpretation. I thought that was maybe the purpose of that chapter, to show that this, I guess, the ways that the church plays a role in making these other more folklorish traditions more obscure or more marginalized. But I guess Max Garfield can also illuminate us on that point as well. Yeah.
It's funny you brought up werewolves. There we go. Great.
And there were also a similar werewolf.
Meows like that. Can you hear her through the mic?
I can hear her. Yeah. Stealing grain from the devil.
Pay attention to me this morning. You went and talked to these people on the internet. Well, that's tough.
Yeah.
All right.
But we're actually getting into, the Rusalka and things of that nature, some of the folklore. But going back to themes, we talked about briefly tyranny, and kind of the flip side of tyranny is freedom and self-determination. That with one, you don't have the other. And so they're very complementary in that respect, or diametrically opposed, whatever. So on the kind of freedom side of that theme, here again, Kay gets a little nuanced, because some of these characters are very, very focused on a certain type of freedom from tyranny, freedom from subjugation, freedom from having identity erased. But then there are other characters who are more focused on freedom to do things, freedom to be able to pursue whatever they want to pursue, to live their lives in a way that may not be subject to the same kinds of cultural or religious or other strictures that society imposes on them, or those expectations. And kind of layered on top of that, you have the Rusalka, who represents kind of fate, that their predestination. And if you have predestination, how much self-determination do you really have? And is the Rusalka, this, which I think is based on a Slavic folklore being, supernatural being, kind of like a mermaid, except without a fishtail. And I don't really remember exactly what in TIGANA it is, but I think if a woman sees a Rusalka, if a woman is alone and sees a Rusalka,
one man sees a
Rusalka,
right.
She's going to have a child, right? And then if a man sees Rusalka alone, he's going to have okay, now I got it back. There's going to be a fork in the road for a man, and his path is going to diverge. I mean, he's going to have a choice. If a woman alone sees a Rusalka, her path is going to be known. Not that there's a fork, she's just going to know her future. If two men see a Rusalka, one of them is going to die and one of them is going to have a fork in the road, or one of them is blessed, something like that. And then if two women see it, the one woman is going to have a child, one woman is going to know her future. And then if three of them see it, child, future, and blessed. And for men, it's die, fork in the road, and blessed. I probably screwed that up. Anyway, there's this idea that
three we see at the end. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I muted myself because my cat was making noise. I have it here. I think for the two, it's not made implicitly clear that like the second will have anything happen to them. I was going to just read it in like GG
maybe that's
words, because he's got one man sees a Rusalka, his life forks there. Two men see a Rusalka, one of them shall die. 3 men see a Roselka. 1 is blessed, 1 forks, 1 shall die. 1 woman sees a Roselka, her path becomes clear to her. 2 women see a Roselka, 1 of them shall bear a child. 3 women see a Roselka, 1 is blessed, 1 is clear, 1 shall bear a child. That's what we got.
Right. And how much of that is being dictated by fate and how much of that is still subject to self-determination is not entirely clear. And then when you kind of turn to the tyranny side of things, you have really interesting juxtaposition of the 2 sorcerers, the 2 tyrants, because they are not well drawn characters at all. And clearly Kay did this intentionally because other characters. Yeah. I mean, you have, I look at those 2 tyrants as essentially MacGuffins. So using kind of a film term, Hitchcock film term. Yeah. They are what the plot revolves around, but they remain pretty much an enigma throughout.
So I think that about Alberco, but I thought Brandon was a very well-drawn character. And I thought the contrast between them was very interesting because like Brandon, I think has a lot more going on. Like Alberco is pretty straightforwardly bad. Like he has motivations that make sense. He's not just like, I want to kill the people. He's like, I want to achieve something, but it's dude wants power. Dude does bad things to achieve power. Like we've seen this. Yeah. I find Brandon to be one of the more interesting. I think Brandon is my favorite GGK, like the best GGK antagonist of all his books. I don't think I would agree that he's a MacGuffin. I think he was a very interesting character. But
well, I didn't say he wasn't interesting.
Okay.
And I think I agree in general with you that he is far more developed than Alberco. Absolutely. But if I remember correctly, there are no POV.
Yeah, what's interesting is we get Alberco's POV. We get Alberco's perspective, and he does seem a bit more one note, oddly. And then with Brandon, we only see him through Dianora's perspective.
Yeah.
But to Jake's point, I think I see both points though. I think that Brandon, he is enigmatic. I think that was a good word for him because there were certain motivations or certain internal thought processes that we don't get to see, that we don't fully understand. We think there might even be some redeeming qualities in him based on some of the decisions he makes later in the book, perhaps. But then he's also awful, like what he did to the prince, to Rune, I guess, who becomes Rune. And then to Jake's perspective. So to Jake's perspective, I could see that as well. I think he's a really interesting character. I had questions at the end about him.
It's also interesting because I think the 2 focal characters who like the most drive the plot is Alison and Brandon. And I don't believe we get a perspective from either of them. Right. We also don't get an Alison perspective.
I agree. They're being filtered through other people's perspectives, other people's feelings about them. And in terms of, the theme for with Brandon, I think one of the things that Kay is doing with really trying to contrast the 2 tyrants is, yes, they're both tyrants, but one of them might actually be a benevolent despot, maybe, possibly.
It's so hard to tell.
If that's the case, is that even possible? I mean, is that an oxymoron? A benevolent despotism? It's still tyranny. It's still a denial of freedom. It's still, it's still bad in many, many ways, even when the tyrant thinks that he's trying to do the right thing. He's trying to do what he believes is good, maybe. But then again, he does some pretty awful things. So it's hard to say that that's actually good when it's clearly creating a lot of harm at the same time. And some of it was revenge motivated at the very beginning, obviously, in stripping Tigana of its identity. And is it actually kind of a commentary on the corrupting influence of power that, even very, very good people, high-minded people can be corrupted by power, that once they get it, once they're able to exercise it, then it's hard to not exercise it. One of the best, I'm paraphrasing, but I think one of the best quotes about power for people who have power is the best use of power is to not use it. That if you can accomplish your goals without having to resort to power, coercion, forcing people, that is the most effective use of power. And it's not clear that, certainly Alberico does not know that lesson at all. But Brandon might once have known that lesson, but lost sight of it over time. But again, Kay doesn't actually come right out and say that. He hints at it. It's all dropping hints left and right.
I think what makes that complicated, though, is that there were people who were true to Brandon at the very end. Even after he demoted himself, there were people who still wanted to be loyal to him.
Mhm.
And so that was the part that made it so interesting to me. But I would love to hear Josh's perspective. Josh, what did you think about the
Yeah,
three tyrants?
I think also with Brandon, so much of what we saw with Brandon was through Dianora's perspective. And I think it speaks volumes when her initial reason to be there is she wants to assassinate him. And then she ends up loving him. So, and I also think she's the best character in the book, but that's probably a future discussion in this thing here. I think that spoke volumes about him as a character, that she was just hell-bent on killing him. And by the end, she's quite the opposite. But it also, I don't know, when you started to see, at least throughout the book, because I think early in the book, I saw two tyrants, and then you started to see kind of Brandon become more humanized. I think in many ways, it also raised Alisar to almost Alisar or Alisan? Alisan kind of raised him almost to kind of an anti-hero when you start to see that, he's almost as single-minded with this as Brandon was before this all started, between the prologue and chapter 1, when he just erases Tigana because of the death of his son. So I think when we started to see more from Brandon, I think it also just kind of, for me, just changed kind of my whole overview of what some of these character motivations were about. And I hadn't even thought about it until, you guys started talking about it, that we'd never got an Alisan POV.
Mm.
And if I had to pick a main character, he's kind of the main character here. I mean, it's
like the focal character. Like he's
he's
the one who, if you remove Alisan, the plot of Tigana doesn't happen.
Yeah.
To the highest degree. I think one of the really interesting things the novel does is it sets up originally, before you see them, as Brandon as like the more hated antagonist between the two. Like it sets up these two antagonists, but it's like, but we hate Brandon more. And then it humanizes the one, like it would have been pretty easier to humanize the one we hate less, but it's going to humanize like the main one. And I think a fundamental difference is kind of similar to what Max said. Like Alberico's motivations are fundamentally like corrupted. Like he's trying to exploit this nation to build influence so he can go try and become emperor. Brandon is arguably not fundamentally corrupt. He has this outside influence of like the anger he has towards Tigana for fighting a completely lost battle that they had like no reason to actually fight. Like the writing was on the wall just to like take out his son, like for their pride. And so he hates this group of his kingdom, and like the motivation of hatred and anger has like seeped into his rule. But the people who aren't affected by that really like, I mean, one person really likes him anyways, but a lot of the people are still very loyal to him because he's loyal to his own. And like, he has the image in his head that he wants to like keep this and make this a stable kingdom where people can live as long as they didn't used to be from Tigana. And also I just think his relationship with Dianora I mean, I agree that Dianora is the best character in this book, like the most interesting. And how, like, I think it's a really interesting perspective to see him through as well, because it's rare you see a character almost solely through the perspective of someone who wants to both kill them and may also be falling in love with them. Like that's
I feel like that's probably a common trope in romantasy,
maybe.
honestly. And I have to say that I think that for any people, because I often hear in fantasy circles that they want to see more aged up women in fantasy, read Guy Gavriel K. Because at least of the 3 books I've read so far, I've been so impressed with his female characters, especially as not all of them are young either. And I think Dianora, I keep saying her name incorrectly, I apologize, is an excellent example of that. As far as the contrast, though, between these characters, I find it is a little ironic, isn't it? That Alisan, is it Alice? I can't now. Now I'm guessing how I say his name.
Oh, I don't know how to pronounce this.
That
I say it
guy.
Allison in my head.
Yes. Well, it's interesting how he seems to be. He keeps making all of these claims towards freedom and the importance of this cause towards freedom. And what does he do? He's preaching, by the way, to Erlaine. Erlaine is the sorcerer that he binds to him. He takes away Erlaine's freedom and he tells Erlaine, you don't have true freedom and you need to join my cause for freedom. And so again, I think that speaks to what Bridger was saying about the differences of like freedom from, or freedom, the way that we're framing freedom. At the same time, I think that Brandine, I think the way that what he did to Rune, even from the beginning, before I knew Rune's identity, I was pretty horrified by what he did to that poor man. And I'm actually really glad that his identity was later revealed, because I was actually really disturbed by that, as looking at a disabled character in a fantasy book being treated in such a manner. And even seeing the way that I guess that trial happened in early on in the book, when he found out about the person who was trying to murder him or conspiring to murder him, and he ends up bursting his head essentially in the middle of the courtroom without flinching. He's actually quite a frightening character when you look at some things that he does throughout the book. And even just looking at his whole entire, I don't know, the whole entire system around him. It's really interesting to look at that character in depth. But I do think it's interesting to contrast what he did with Rune, he did with the Prince of TIGANA, and to contrast what Alisar did with Erlaine.
And exactly to that point, we don't know why exactly they did either of those things, because we don't have a POV narrative from either of those characters, from Brandon or Alisan. We simply know how other people are describing their actions. We know what they're doing, but we don't ever know why they're doing. We can infer it maybe, and clearly Kay drops hints. But this is one of the things I love about Kay, is he doesn't usually come right out and tell you something. He describes things indirectly. He drops hints. He makes inferences, or creates a situation where you have to infer things from other actions, other pieces of information. And in this case, I think this was a very intentional decision on Kay's part, because the 2 characters whose choices, whose actions are the most instrumental in the entire book are Brandon and Alisan. Their choices drive the vast majority of this story, but we never know exactly why they're making those choices. And that ambiguity there, I think, gives more freedom to the reader to try to really, assign meaning to it and significance, and, play with the themes. So, Kay isn't spoon feeding this to you. You get to figure it out for yourself, and you can come to different conclusions. Different readers are going to interpret these things differently. And that's how Kay, I think, addresses almost all of these themes in the book, that they are indirect. They are implied in many cases. You have, let me think, I'm trying to think of another example just off the top of my head, and one will come to me. But that's where I think the genius of Brandon and Alisan are. But it's also why I consider Brandon to be something of a MacGuffin, not nearly as much as Alberico, but because we really don't know much about him. We don't know why, he's doing things or exactly what his thought processes are. We just simply know what his actions are, and we know how some of the people around him react to him. And as you point out, many people love him. They are very loyal to him, unlike Alberico. Alberico, nobody loves Alberico. He is, the quintessential tyrant, just cruel and heartless and really despicable. And yet Brandon can also do some pretty cruel and heartless things, is beloved.
Yeah. It's
Even by
so
someone who swore to kill him. I mean, her life's mission was to assassinate him, and yet she ends up spending 14 or more years, however many years, as his consort, essentially.
That's procrastination. I
Yeah.
thought I procrastinated.
I wondered too about the castrates that were in Brandon's court. I know that that's obviously pulling from history, studied about castrati and music history. And if you study about them in music history, the castrati, at least for vocal purposes, they were like rock stars in their days. They were very prestigious musicians. They were very beloved. Women loved them. They were a good form of birth control. But in this case, I wondered, I know that he's pulling from historical influences, having castrates in Brandon's court, but I also wondered, is the means to make these men castrate, was that a punishment? I think it was. It seemed to be tied to that. And so that was another area where I had questions too.
I don't remember that very well.
You don't remember that? Shelto is essentially that.
Yeah, I think
okay.
it was because my recollection is vague, but I seem to recall that he was someone of significance, of consequence, before Brandon's rise to power, or maybe he was captured in one of the conquered lands. I don't quite recall, but I do remember Shelto being of significance before he was castrated. He was someone important, and it was to that extent a punishment, a neutering of him in the context of this story.
Yeah,
it's not really historical. I mean, I think the musical references that you were making, Johanna, I mean, those were very much, I mean, religiously based, trying to, at least as I understand it, to capture the purity of sound for the glory of God.
they became very, very well-known musicians. I mean, they
Yeah.
basically played the female roles in operas back in that time, and they were very highly regarded. But I do think, like I said, that obviously was a horrible thing that people did back then, and did it obviously to young boys. So that was not by choice, but that was probably different than what this is, actually, now that I think about it, because these were probably grown men at
Yeah.
the time that they're being castrated. So I think it was a punishment, and it obviously doesn't reflect well on on Brandon's character that he would do such a thing. And yet people were still loyal to him. And it makes you wonder, was that loyalty based on fear, or was it based on something else? And with Dianora's feelings for him, that was also interesting to me, because there was a line where she asked Brandon, because she knows he's a very powerful sorcerer, and she asks him, are you magically manipulating my feelings for you? And he said, no, not in the way that you think. I can't control that. And so I wondered, actually, I had this theory, and it turned out not to be true, or not to be said. If that was the case, I don't think it was the case, but I had this theory at the beginning. I thought, okay, so he's not manipulating her feelings for her. But maybe I kind of had this idea that he was manipulating her in another way. And I can't remember exactly what the theory was now that I think about it. But I did feel like there was some kind of manipulation going on, but I don't think that was the case. I think she really did love him, and it was very complicated for her. And I'll say also about Dianora's perspective, I love that we have essentially in this story, we have this whole crusade that is gathering around Alisan and group and Baird. we have this whole group that's forming, that's on this mission to take down Brandon and the other tyrant. And meanwhile, we have Dianora, and she's operating completely solo, trying to do the same thing, but just to one of the tyrants, and not knowing them not knowing about each other was a really powerful, I think, narrative choice. And the fact that they never know about each other, she never learns about this other group of people who are essentially trying to do what she's doing, but obviously with another added component to it. And they never know about her. They never essentially learn that she's Barrett's sister. Barrett has a guess, but they never learn that.
I
And
really
there's-
like, so Shelto, who's the goat, he obviously knows Brandon pretty well, and he probably knew Brandon as like someone who's not, he doesn't consider like a horrible person from his youth, but has done a lot of really bad things, and a lot of his really bad things he's done has been motivated like by revenge for like the loss of his son against people who had no actual involvement with it, just happened to take place in the same country. And I think that's part of his reason why at the end he doesn't tell them about Dianora, because he knows that Alison, a person who might be like a fundamentally pretty good person, could then have taken revenge in like a very similar way as Brandon did, and it could have corrupted him in like the same way.
Interesting. I mean, that's a beauty of that, is that we don't know. We only have guesses.
I like
So-
how by
yeah,
setup,
to me, I mean, just to piggyback on both of your points there, I think that's one of the geniuses of the way Kay always wraps up his endings, is he doesn't go with the, okay, we're going to tell everybody that this was the prince, and we're going to tell everybody this was Dianora. You know, there's none of that kind of wish fulfillment BS that you get in a lot of other authors. You know, the minute you realize when Shelto's not going to tell that was the prince, you know, immediately I'm hit with just these melancholy feelings that, you know, his whole story isn't going to get told. But then you realize the greater picture, and that was the best move. And to me, that's one of the just small illustrations of why Kay's works, for me, skew on the literary end, is because he never takes that easy way out. It would be easy for them to just not think about those repercussions. Oh, that was the prince, and this was Dianora. Hey, Bear, that's your sister did all that. You know, it would have been really easy for them to find out their fates. And then just knowing that you as the reader know more than the characters involved. I mean, that's, again, this is part of just something that I think Kay just hits so well.
especially since recognition is such a huge part of this novel, and it's like it hurts that he's now not getting the
Yes.
recognition for everything he went through. And I was gonna say, I like how the setup for the novel, you'd think it has like Brandon mirrored with Alberico. I actually think like he's a lot more similar to Alison than he is to Alberico, and I think the novel starts to like very subtly make you more and more aware that these are the two people who actually you should be thinking of similarly and as a mirror to each other, not Brandon and Alberico. And I think that's also part of them not having any perspectives, but being the focal point of the most of the other perspectives.
It's like an anti-hero and an anti-villain.
Yeah, that is absolutely, goodness. The end of this book, I have to admit, I disagree with whoever said that they didn't like the ending. I thought the
fair.
ending was so
Amazing.
good.
Amazing.
I think the most emotional moment for me was that moment with Shelto, because not only Shelto, but with the Prince of Tigana, the original Valentine, I think it is, Prince
Yeah, I think so.
Valentine.
That sounds right.
The compassion that he shows in his eyes towards Dianora, because he's seen her all these years. He knows she's from Tigana. He knows, and yet I think he knows that she loves him too, and he knows how complicated it is for her. And at the same time, he still wants vengeance for what he's done to his land and to him. There are so many complicated layers there in one moment. I just think that whole entire exchange was such a gut punch for me, but it was beautiful the way that, or so poignant, I should say, the way that Shelto withheld that information, withheld from Alison that Alison that his father was the one who was lying there. Yeah, I love what you said too about legacy. That's so well said. So well said.
Bittersweet is the word that I
Bittersweet.
use to describe just about all of his endings. And I love that.
That's my
It's like
favorite kind of ending.
because you get the joy mixed with the sorrow, and it's such a potent combination. I mean,
Yes.
the mixture of the two is really, at least for me, the best kind of catharsis
I think he's
in
the
reading.
Absolutely.
best person
Yeah.
I've read at having scenes that are both inspiring and tragic very strongly at the same time.
Yeah. And he ends a little bit lighthearted, I think, in that epilogue. I mean, I thought it was a little bit light,
But then
lightened the
it
tone
kind
a
of
little bit.
goes like with the three men seeing a Rizalka, which
Oh,
Eric
yeah.
doesn't like. I really like
Oh,
because it's
that.
kind of
I like it too.
it's the like life is gonna go on. There's gonna be conflict that goes on. There is no end to the story. This is just the end of a part of the story, and I mean, so I love that. Like, it just immediately gives you all these questions and doesn't let you leave with the thought that, oh, that was all wrapped up very nicely. They're all like doing their thing. Like you don't get to leave. That's not how life works, and that's not how it's gonna go for
Yeah.
these three people. One of them is gonna die. One is gonna their path. I already forgot what it was. The other two things.
Yes. And I want to bring up Max Garfield's point. He brought up a really good point, which is the historic reasoning behind the eunuchs outside of the obvious reasons in the harem was often that it cut from any familial ties. Their power would be tied to loyalty to the ruler in theory. And I think that's a really good point. I also want to say that speaking about Shelto again, I think his friendship with Dianora was also powerful, and it was also what made this whole it was a part of the conflict for her. Part of the conflict for her was Brandon, of course, but I think part of the conflict was also Shelto, and she had friends there.
Yeah.
I think she grew to love it there. She grew to see some good things. So I love that friendship though, and I think he loved her, and that was definitely shown at the end.
But I think my favorite, I like all the ambiguous K endings. I think my favorite one is part of one that isn't close to my favorite K book. I think it's the ending of River of Stars, which obviously only one person here hasn't read, so sorry. But now you can look forward to it.
River of Stars, isn't that a sequel? Or
Yeah,
am I
well,
wrong?
it's like
Kind of
the
a sequel.
standalone that takes place 300 years after. So you should read it second, but don't expect it to be like a follow-up of the story of Under Heaven. It's its own completely separate story that takes place like 3 or 4 centuries later that just has like some references to Under Heaven that enrich the experience of reading.
Got it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's another bittersweet ending. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. If it's okay for me to talk about this, I hope it's okay for me to talk about, but I do think that speaking to Bridger's points at the very beginning, there are certain things that are definitely not going to be okay with certain readers. There were some very uncomfortable, unsettling things in this story, and I didn't even think about it when I talked about my spoiler-free review, which I probably should have mentioned, but there's incest in this story. There are a lot of really strange. There was a strange closet scene at the beginning. I understand. I have been told before that that scene was tied into the theme or one of the themes of Tigana. I have a hard time seeing that. I did talk about the renewal one that I thought I saw. And then there was a scene with Devin, and I could tell there was
That one was a bit much.
that one. I could tell there was an attempt to tie theme into that one. There was some line about if this is what love is, or what is freedom, if this is what love is, something like that.
I mean, is that one, equating sex with power, maybe?
I think it's part of the like people who he talks about it at the end where people like under tyranny like rebel in certain ways. I think it was I don't like that. It was too long. Like 3 pages was like 2.8 too many pages for that. Maybe 2.9. Like
I also rolled my eyes a bit because that particular scene, not to give away spoilers, but there's something regarding tying to bedposts that have happened in other K books I've read. So I kind of rolled my eyes a little bit at that. But I did think, yeah, it did go on a while. That's a good point.
this is when Kyle complains about this one. I'm like, yeah, you're right. 3 pages is like at least 2.8 pages too long for
Yeah.
what you needed there, in my opinion, at least. But I remember on reread, I was like, okay, like you're trying to do something here, and normally when you're trying to do something, I think you really succeeded. I don't know about this one. I don't know about this one, GGK. This is a bit of a stretch.
Yeah. Well, and I think the challenge with some of these scenes too is that they to me as a reader, I felt like all of them felt very abrupt. Like they just spontaneously kind of happened, at least for my taste. Whereas I didn't feel that way when I read The Lions of Aubuson or A Song for a Bone. I kind of felt the build up to those things. But in
I
this
thought
case,
the
that
first one, the
was,
closet one, was I think more important for like character than theme. I think for like
yeah.
it being something that was very like not the type of thing that Katrina would do, and like kind of dedication wise, like in terms of what she's doing for the cause. And I think probably was pretty important to like their dynamic going forward. But it was also weird, but whatever. I like definitely the 3-page one with Devin and the lady, I forget her name, was the one where if you could, if I could cut 2 GGK scenes from his entire bibliography, it would be this one, and there's one in chapter 1 of The Last Light of the Sun, and those would be the 2 where I'd be like, did we need to go there? I don't know about that, but
Yeah. I
I
have,
agree. I was just going to say, I thought the closet scene did add to the story. It was awkward, uncomfortable, but
okay.
it did illustrate Catriona's commitment and willingness to sacrifice for a larger cause. You know, something that she didn't want to, but felt the need to because it was so important to do that in that situation. I didn't really like it. But I really, the one that bothered me more was Dianora.
mhm.
And I wanted to like Dianora's character. I really wanted to like her character. And there are aspects of it I do like. But in some respects, she's too much of a black box. I mean, the incest has, in my opinion, a really weak foundation. You know, that it's okay, great, she's close to her brother, but did she really need to be that close to her brother? I don't, the need for that aspect of her personality, her relationship with her brother, I didn't quite think it was necessary. And so it did feel a little gratuitous. And, you know, by extension, her relationship with Brandon didn't ever feel real to me. I wanted it to feel real, but again, it was never exactly clear what she fell in love with. You know, what exactly about Brandon convinced her not to assassinate him, and you know, not only to withhold her original plan, but to, as she thinks about it, fall in love with him. All we know, and this is one of my criticisms of this, is pretty much all of the love stories in this book, we're told that characters are falling in love with one another, but we don't really ever see it. We don't see, and for me, it's very strange because, as I said a little while ago, Kay does such a great job of implying things. I mean, he describes things with metaphor and other, you know, types of techniques indirectly, but makes it very clear what he's trying to get across without actually spelling it out. But in the case of all of the romantic relationships, he didn't do it, at least didn't do it well in this case. I think in some of his other books, he does it very, very well. But this is one of the examples where I think he's still learning how to do it and hadn't quite mastered it. And I was very frustrated with Dianora as a result.
That's a really good point, by the way, because I think that was why at the beginning I kept thinking there had to be some kind of magical manipulation going on, because the reasoning behind her attraction to him was just described as looking into his eyes and starting to quiver. That was extent of it. So I agree with you, actually. I don't know that I got a lot of history. I think, speaking of buy-in, as you were saying at the beginning, Jake, I think you have to have a certain amount of buy-in for her attraction to Brandon and understand that they have a long history before the book even starts. I did notice before we got to the incest scene, I was taking note. It just came to my mind while I was reading that whenever characters wanted to gravitate towards intimacy, they were usually, with the exception of the closet one, I felt as though many times when they were gravitating towards wanting intimacy, they were wanting to do so in needs of solace, in needs to resolve some sort of emotional um, upheaval in them. Like they wanted to feel comforted through that act. That came up numerous times. But then when we got to that particular scene, I thought it went too far. I thought this is not comfortable at all. This is weird. It was awkward. I will say though that with Catriona, I do agree it shows what she was willing to do in that closet scene. I can't argue with that. At the same time, I feel like she proved herself quite a few times in the book. She
Yeah.
jumping off of a tower
Right.
and well, a couple of times jumping from high places. But one thing I appreciated is even though this doesn't resolve the issue of not showing us the complaint that you had, Bridger, I one thing I did appreciate is that the whole entire story, I kept feeling like we were going to have some sort of backwards romance plot line going on between Devin and Catriona. I kept thinking, oh no, we're bringing those two together, and I didn't like it, and I didn't want them together. I didn't feel it. I wasn't comfortable with it. And when it turned out to be Allison and Catriona, I'll be honest, I know that was very abrupt too. It was very much an insta love kind of thing, but I loved it. And I also thought that that particular passage, and part of it is Kay's prose again, because the prose in that scene is gorgeous. And it also speaks to that theme of renewal too, and the bittersweet feelings that go along with that theme, bringing forth the past and wanting to go towards the future and the uncertainty there, and so many emotions that went into that. And I think that Devin, his perspective of looking at Catriona and what she was willing to do when she jumped out of from the tower, when she jumped from the window, all of those perspectives coming from Devin, he was saying over and over again about how proud of her he was and how she was willing to sacrifice all, and what an incredible character. But what you don't realize, I guess, because you don't get Alison's perspective, is that he's having the same thoughts or feelings.
I agree with everything you just said. That I loved the fact that it was a red herring, the Devin Catriona relationship. I didn't want them to get together, despite their encounter in the closet. I mean, I thought that's the easy way out, and he didn't take it. But at the same time, the big reveal at the very end that Alison has been in love with Catriona for years, but has never expressed it, just seemed a little out of left field. It's like, could you have at least laid a little bit of groundwork for this? I mean, I didn't mind quite as much the Devin and Elias, or I think that's what her name was. I didn't mind that quite as much because Kay drops a few hints here and there that Devin's kind of intrigued by her, even though he doesn't really spell out why he's intrigued. And Elias doesn't actually do a whole lot to attract his attention. I mean, she's not a major part of the narrative. And so you get these hints, but at least there's a little bit more groundwork than with Allison and Catriona, which just, and he did express himself very well in that admission of love.
He's smooth, but Allison's smooth. You gotta give him
It was so well written. It was so well written.
Needed more groundwork to really have the payoff.
It kind of made sense, at least. Yeah.
I can make the third part of this because we've got team Allison and Catriona was kind of, I don't know if it worked. We've got team, and also Dianora and Brandon. Then we've got, I kind of see that for Dianora and Brandon, but I actually kind of like Al. And to me, like, I bought Dianora and Brandon's relationship. I find it hard to express why. I read this a long time ago, but like I did fully buy into that aspect of the relationship. Like it really felt there for me. It's every time, like if I scroll through Tigana quotes, on the other hand, like it gets the Alice on saying like that, like you are like the law of my heart. And I'm like, did that really, like, is that really there? Whatever. So I would say I was going to mention, I think one aspect of the cupboard scene is it led to Catriona having a bitterness towards Devon because it didn't work. That isn't necessarily Devon's fault that like her doing that and like the commitment didn't work. But I think it's a very human thing that like if someone going like, all right, like showing that level of commitment and doing something they're uncomfortable for, I think it really bothered her that like it ended up being for nothing and that it wasn't successful and led to part of like the bitterness contributed to a bitterness she might have had towards Devon that he's I think a little unaware of, but he's doing his best.
I did like how it provided tension between those two characters because I thought that was a good dynamic, especially early in the book as Devon's kind of becoming part of this group. You have this initial tension between those two. I want to circle back real quick to Dianora and then pose a question of all of you because I had a thought that popped into my head that I don't know if you guys agree or not. The first one was just the whole incest thing. That there's two lines of dialogue that accompany that scene really stuck with me. And it was Baird saying, "What are we doing?" And she says, "What's been done of us? What's been done to us?" And for me, that just in many ways just informed how damaged a person she is, that this is kind of her only solace at this point is in the arms of her brother. But the thing I want to ask is just looking forward when we get to Brandon and the scene you were talking about, Joanna, talking about when she asks him whether or not, he's casting a spell on her. My thought was, well, the spell is Stockholm Syndrome. That's what's going on here. And I don't know, do you guys agree with that? Or did you buy that she was just truly in love with him? Or if this was just a result of, stereotypical Stockholm Syndrome?
The thought did cross my mind. But I just don't think Kay gave enough evidence of either interpretation. I think it's subject to reader interpretation based on very, very limited clues. But I definitely was thinking along those lines, going, this doesn't quite add up. So maybe there is something else like Stockholm.
Yeah.
It's probably not. It's not a healthy foundation for a relationship. I think we can all grant that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I want to ask Josh. You made a comment at the very beginning of this stream. You were talking about how much you love the world building.
Yeah.
Here, and you said this might be the best world building. I don't know if the best you've ever read from Kay, but did you say it's the best world building from any author? Or
no, I was saying more general with Kay that I think he's the best world builder, period.
Oh, okay.
Because I just feel I'm not a very good visual reader. I don't picture things very well, but when I read his books, I can picture things vividly, and that says a lot about just what he does. I mean, I think it does help a little bit that you have kind of the parallels that you can see in, for instance, in this book, even though it's kind of seems like a Southern Hemisphere country. I mean, it's Italy, it's the palm instead of the boot, that I could kind of picture things a little bit along those lines. But I think even more than that is just, I think his attention to culture in all of his books just oozes through the page for me. And I don't know if this is a result of him being, working with Christopher Tolkien on the Silmarillion, that just got into his DNA as far as who he is as an author. That supreme world building is. I just think he's the best at this of the modern fantasy authors that I've read. So that's more of what I was alluding to, not specifically on Tigana, but just as a whole. That's the thing that just blows me away with him.
I think it's interesting because, like, I think I would describe strength as like his use of setting. I don't like world building feels not like, I think he's very good at world building. It's not quite what I would attribute to like what is amazing about it. In terms of world building, to me feels like the back end creation of the world, which they're very good, but I feel like it's how he uses it and how the setting is always very impactful and influential on the characters in the novel, and that the people always feel like they're from the setting. But I don't know. I see where you're coming from.
I agree. I agree with you, Jake. It's not the world building itself; it's how he uses it that is really, really incredible.
Also,
and
this is better because if you describe it this way, it's a better pitch for non-fantasy fans. Because if you tell a non-fantasy field the
True. They
world
don't know.
building is good, they're like,
They don't know
world
what that
building. But
is.
if you
Yeah.
tell them the setting
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
good,
Right.
they're like, oh,
Right.
setting.
Yeah, plot, character, setting, right?
His world building is simultaneously very shallow and very deep, because many aspects of the setting he doesn't describe. He doesn't really provide much detail. I mean, think about it. I mean, I brought a handy map here. You have this map of the peninsula here that
Yes.
has all of these different provinces. And of course, if you're reading this book by listening to it on audiobook, it can be confusing because he's talking about all these different provinces, but he never really describes what makes each province really unique. How can you paint this mental picture of each of these provinces to give them their own distinct identity? You don't really get that in here. And so if you don't have a map to recognize, okay, here's the relationship between these things, that characters are traveling from one point to the next, but you don't really know, are they going east? Are they going north? Are they going south? What geographically, spatially, it's hard to keep track of these things because Kay doesn't really provide a whole lot of detail about that. Likewise, as I said, you don't really know much about the cultures of these provinces, but you do get certain very, very targeted deep dives. You get, things about their religious practices, things about some of the cultural ceremonies that take place, things about, some of the beliefs that motivate the peoples of those provinces. You get it in great detail. And it's almost, I'm going to use a musical term here, a couple of them. It's almost like coloratura or ornamentation in music, that he adds these flourishes that give a richness to the story and make it feel real and immersive, even while he's completely skimping on so many other aspects of his world building. And I think that's part of how he's able to write standalone novels, because he's not putting in stuff that's not necessary. There certainly there are readers who love to just wallow in world building, even inconsequential world building. I just want to be in that setting in all of its detail. It's like, okay, but that doesn't always serve the story. And Kay, his world building serves the story, and it serves it well. And I think it's excellent world building, but it's nowhere near complete. It's very inconsistent in how he uses it, but it's very, very, very intentional. That's why I agree with you, Jake, that it's not so much the world building itself as is how he uses it, how he designs it for very specific purposes.
Yeah, I think it also can come down to how you define world building too, because if you talk about history and lore, he does go on about some of the history and lore at certain times and backstories of people's.
Right.
I agree though about some of what you're saying, where he minimizes a lot at the same time. Like you're right. If I try to picture Brandon's court and I try to picture that what those people are like, what that culture is like. I get a sense of more the psychology of the characters and what they're interested in and how they're interested in land, but I don't get much in detail. I still think though that the details that I really gravitate towards, I love the use of song that he has in his stories. I love that there was even attempt to, I guess it's the little details to me that make a big difference. So even when he talks about the wine, the blue wine versus the green wine, or he talks about the moons in the sky, and speaking to what you and Jacob were both saying, how that affects how characters respond to the setting, the way that they act in the setting. I love how he does that. He takes into account how much they would see if both moons are shining versus only one, how dark or light it is. He talks about the seasons. He talks about and I think the seasonal touches, by the way, like whether it's cold weather or there's snow on the mountains ahead of them. He talks about little details like that. He uses excellent imagery. Um, so for me, I thought that it was very immersive in that regard. And so I could totally see what you're talking about, Josh, because I felt that way too. I felt like I could picture things extremely well when
It'd be
reading his
like
book.
the equivalent of like if he'd invented Vancouver as a setting. Some authors would be like, I know all the streets on Vancouver. I know it's on every street in Vancouver. I know how they originally came up with how it's designed to get places. I know that there's a four-way stop here. I know there's a traffic light here. And Kay's more like, yeah, but like, what's it like to be in Vancouver? Like, how does the rain sound? How do you respond to that? Like, are you surprised when it's cold out? Like, what's the lighting like at night? What does it look like when like when you are going over the bridge? Like, how does it affect the atmosphere when the sun is going down over the ocean? And it's kind of makes it feel like I can picture where they are and that it's relevant to who the characters are in a very different way. But also, like, some people I think do that pretty well as well, and also can tell you what every street is.
So I just opened up to a random page. So beginning of a chapter, chapter 9. It was cold in the gully by the side of the road. There was a thin, sheltering line of birch trees between them and the gates of the Nivolene estate. But even so, the wind was a knife whenever it picked up. There had been snow last night, a rare thing this far north, even in midwinter. It had made for a white, chilled second night of riding from Faroe Town, where they had started, but Elasan had refused to slow their pace. So he right away gives you some details about the atmosphere and the weather and the cold and the snow. I think those little things add up, even though it's not detailing every single description. For me as a visual reader, and this is kind of a tangential topic, I find I can sometimes visualize more when it's not overly descriptive, but I feel like he always like Bridger was saying, he makes it so relevant to the story, to what's going on in the moment.
We don't need to know the history of that castle. It's more important that we know what's it like to be in that castle.
That's interesting, Joanna, because I'm not a visual reader at all. And that's why I struggle with certain authors, is when I guess they don't put me in the setting like you're saying. I need to think about that, because maybe that is a reason, because he gives you more than just like the visual descriptions, but he's giving you the atmosphere and how the other senses feel. Maybe that gets me more immersed than simply describing what that castle looks like.
It's the emotion of the setting rather than just this is a snowy field that they're going by. You know, it's more the visceral feel of that setting.
Completely agree.
Yeah. So any other points we want to touch on? I mean, I know there's so much we could talk about with this book.
I really like
the one character.
He's got the two daughters who he pretends he's constantly trying to marry off and get rid of, but actually it's like super wholesome. I'd just like to say, I really like those people. Anyway,
I liked the character. I forget his name. It was the Duke's son who was gay, and he played up his Tommaso. Yes. I really like that character, and I wish he'd been there longer, because I want to think that this was kind of a unique character in fantasy, especially at the time. And I loved how it was a very intelligent character that was just being overly flamboyant so that people wouldn't take him seriously. I thought there was a lot of depth to that very short-lived character. I wish we'd seen more of that character.
He was excellent. He's such a well-written character. I agree.
Also, I haven't talked much about the start, but I really like how you get this like prologue, and then obviously no one, because I feel like when we played Fantasy, you write the prologue, and then as soon as you start chapter 1, you're looking to like connect it to the prologue to get your
Yeah.
bearings of where you
Yeah.
are, and there's none of that because no one remembers it. And it's like you spend this time and you're just waiting for the connection, and then finally when you get to like the house and like Alison shows up, you get the connection to the prologue and you realize what's going on, and it's like you've just been like searching for where to go, and then this is like, oh, and now I know where I'm at. I'm oriented, and I really find that effective. I've seen someone once DNF this book because they read the prologue, and then the first 2 chapters had nothing to do with the prologue, and I was like, bro, that's the entire point. Whatever. We're moving on.
No, and I love how in chapter 1 we're introduced to that poet that we never see again, and then we learn later on that he was taken by the wheel for being a poet, for standing against the tyranny.
Attention to detail.
And then Alison takes on his name later on in his memory. That was so touching. So
I
yeah,
want to go back to something.
go ahead.
I was just going to say, I want to go back to something you said, Joanna, just a couple of minutes ago when you were talking about emotions. And I think that's the central hallmark for Kay's writing in general, is he writes very emotion-laden stories. I mean, that's the glue that holds everything together and gives you the big payoff at the end. But it's the way he does it that I think is really intriguing, because he doesn't really talk about emotions. Not really, not directly. He induces them. You know, he talks about actions. He talks about decisions. He talks about consequences that induce an emotional response in the reader. And that's a really, really, I mean, just amazing skill to have. You know, he's not saying, you know, use love as he's not saying how much in love people are. He's
Maybe
describing
not the best example for which emotion.
I know, not the best example. I know. That's why I say I use that one. But in other cases, you know, the loss, the tragic feelings, the you know, the jealousies, the I mean, just name an emotion, and he rarely is describing it outright. He's describing settings, situations, actions, reactions that make you feel that emotion. And so, like I said, it's inductive in how he writes it, and I love that. I mean, it's essentially analogous to show don't tell.
Yes.
That, you know, he's showing the emotion or showing what is giving rise to the emotion, and letting you figure that out. You know, and feel the emotion vicariously, which may be a reason why some readers really don't connect with Kay's works. I mean, if emotional types of stories aren't things that you really enjoy or are comfortable with, or maybe just haven't matured to the point that they resonate as much. I mean, I use myself as an example. In my early 20s, I would not have probably enjoyed any of Kay's books nearly to the extent that I do now.
Maybe I'll enjoy them even more. I'll be like, maybe when I'm 40, I'll be like, you know, 24-year-old me, he was a GGK hater. Look at that.
I wouldn't have been a hater in my 20s, but it just wouldn't have resonated at all the same way.
Jake, you're the outlier.
I think also one thing is, for the people who don't, I think when you have like the inductive and not describing emotion, if you read it and you don't feel the emotion, then you're just like, this is kind of dry. Which I've seen people describe, like when they don't like it, when they start and they're like, oh, it was kind of like dry boring. And I'm like, what? How? But I guess it's if that emotion isn't being inducted, then it's just like, this is just describing setting, places, and things. Like, there's no emotion. What's going on? And I'm like, no, there's so much.
You know, it's so interesting because even apart from just the setting, like there were some speeches. I mean, even the speeches I was talking about earlier that Alison gives, and Sandra too, about freedom and this greater cause. And I kept on having those typical fantasy words come up in my mind of truth, honor, courage, but they never say truth, honor, and courage. They never use those words, but they still evoke those feelings and that inspiration. And this is something I was talking about with with Tori on her channel about epic fantasy recently. I think that that's something that I love in Kay's writing and that has made me realize that it's one of the reasons I love fantasy. And oddly, that has nothing to do with magic. You don't need magic to talk about truth, honor, courage. And of course, he doesn't do so in a generic way. It's very layered. So I want to be clear about that. However, he does that. He does it in a layered way. He does it in a complex, nuanced way. And yet, like I said, it doesn't need magic in order to do that, but it does serve. I think it does help that it's in a secondary world. I think if you tried to have speeches like that in our current world, I think we're just I don't think we would resonate with it in our modern culture, but for some reason we resonate with it in fantasy. It speaks to some higher ideal that we maybe feel like we've lost or forgotten, and yet I think that Kay does that so well.
By the Sunhound, they haven't discussed Serentine because I haven't. Well,
I
library.
haven't read
letter.
it yet.
I haven't convinced two of them to read it, but
I'm reading it. I'm reading it this year.
Okay, but I'll be here because Serentine is my personal favorite of Kay's works, so
Okay.
I'll be here.
And it is outstanding. And I mean, all of his works, I mean, they're historical fantasies, but I mean, there's a theme in all of his books about history that he sort of challenges history from two different perspectives, you know, and I think I talked about this in my own K video that, you know, you've got these competing theories about history. You know, there's the sort of large scale movement kind of history that, you know, history is the result of large scale forces that are inexorable, that just, there's no way to stop these big trends and forces. And then you have on the other side of the argument, the great man theory, what used to be called the great man theory. And it's just this very focused approach that says even the smallest thing can change, that, you know, the actions of one person can change history. And Kay has it both ways. His settings tend to be the juxtaposition of competing forces, you know, these big forces. In this case, in TIGANA, you have not only these all-powerful sorcerers imposing their will that, you know, are very, very difficult to oppose, but the actions of one of those sorcerers has just completely wiped an entire country off the map. How do you combat that? How do you combat that kind of sorcery when it's so overpowering? So that's the setting, but then the action tends to focus on the actions of individuals. And it's, you know, to use a metaphor, it's sort of like history as a pebble or history as an avalanche. You know, the big great forces approach looks at it as an avalanche. You can't stop an avalanche. It's going to happen. And so this is just the course of history. Let's describe it. The pebble theory says, yeah, but an avalanche has to come from somewhere. And every avalanche starts with a pebble or something equivalent to that, some small event, action that then starts cascading.
For example,
And
I started trying to get people to GGK, and then I get more people saying we need GGK, and now we're starting a GGK avalanche, where as many people as possible. And now those not a part of it see the avalanche coming, and it's unavoidable, and it shall take over.
Exactly. And so that's part of what makes all of his stories really interesting, for me at least, because I love history and learning from it, and he's basically going full speed ahead down both tracks and saying you can think of it, or you can view it from this lens, or you can view it from this lens, and they both work. But to get the real emotional component, he's really more focused on the pebble. I mean, it's what choices are these individuals making? How are they able to, you know, both individually and then collectively with a small group of individuals who then attract an even larger group of individuals, ultimately affect the change that they're seeking? I mean, that's the story of TIGANA.
One
That's
could even say that the
beautifully
great events
said.
of an age appear to those living through them as a backdrop only to the vastly more compelling dramas of their own lives. And how could it be otherwise? We're making references that only one person here has the potential to get, but that's from maybe my favorite page in fiction. That's a Sarantine Mosaic quote.
Okay, well, I'll get there. I'll get there, Jake. That was so
I-
well said. I loved the avalanche and the pebble. That was excellent. That was so well said. I think another thing that I think about with this book and that leaves me questioning is the cost and time limit to vengeance. Like, at what point, like, especially from Brandon's perspective, he does all this, the pebble being the death of his son or the murder of his son. And at what point has that cost been paid? Is there a time limit to it? You know, and it's obviously it and to flip that around, was that even the right thing to do? I mean, obviously, I think that we're seeing a critical view of revenge in this story. At the same time as we're seeing a critical view of revenge, at the end, Sandre gets revenge on the other tyrant, on wait, is it?
Alberico?
Thank you, Alberico.
I don't know.
So, and all the while, we're seeing Sandre as being on the side of Tigana and on the good guy side, but then he gets revenge. I mean, obviously, it doesn't have the same long-term consequences as it did for Tigana, maybe? I don't know. It just left me with a lot of questions about that theme. And I love that. I love that this book got me to question things and still left me with questions.
Well, I have a question for you all, because at least two of you are artists. And Jake, I don't mean
I'm
to
not.
leave you out, but I don't know enough about
No,
you. Maybe
correct. 2 is the correct number. Other people. I'll appreciate other people's art, and that's good enough for me.
Okay, so please, no offense intended here. I just know, but I know that Joanna and Josh are very musically inclined, and I'm curious what you think broadly, based on the books that you've read so far. But if you want to tie it specifically into Tigana, I mean, that would also be great. What roles do art and music play? I mean, that Kay is using them. I mean, it's not just that, hey, this is entertainment, this is music, this is atmosphere, this is part of setting. I mean, it is all of those things. But clearly he's using art and music and the creative side of humanity in a very intentional way, or multiple ways. What do you think some of those ways are?
I'll let Josh go first, since I feel like
I think in here, I think in many ways, a lot of people have done it as well. I think Kay is some of the best I've seen portraying music on the page. And I see with these two books, this and Arbonne, and this was written first, and Arbonne, I think, is the kind of the pinnacle of that I've seen so far. Again, my sample size is smaller, but I think in many ways it taps into culturally what he's talking about, how the music of kind of the oppressed, it becomes such an important facet of their culture that they still express themselves through it. And I think that was such a big part, because you see so many scenes in here where they're using music as entertainment, but then they stop and they use it almost as political statement or other ways to just drive home a point that's not necessarily driving home a point. And I want to say that there was a scene. Was there a scene in Brandon's court where musicians performed something that was almost anti him, that they got away with because they were musicians? I don't remember if that was the case and if it was part of the assassination plot or not, but I think just as a broad sense, it just shows just the importance of music in all of these people's lives. And specifically in the case of this book, how it just kind of keeps their culture and their upbringing as an important part of what they do.
that's so well said. I love that. I think that's beautifully said. I would just echo that and say, yeah, I think that when we talk about the death of, or the potential murder of a kingdom or of a province with Tigana, we're talking not only about the erasing the name of it, but there was also destruction done to the libraries and to
Sculptures.
the sculptures, to the art, and yeah, to burning away all of the history from the libraries on and everything. But I think that's beautifully said. I love the way you put that, Josh, because I think there's almost like a meta perspective of that with this book in the sense that it's a piece of art. It's a, it's something that could be entertainment, but it's still speaking very broadly to the human condition. It's something that could be enjoyed on one level, but also deeply, deeply taken in on a different level. Um, so I think that that speaks to the importance of it. And it's like like any great work of art. Like, I guess we can compare it, for example, Josh and I are both fans of Beethoven. And so if we look at the Ninth Symphony, that's obviously a very incredible piece of music. It's an incredible, monumental piece of music that people can go and sit and enjoy, even if they haven't studied music before. But then you learn the layers behind it. You learn the history behind it. And I think that Kay wants us to do that, perhaps. Even though I'm not a great history buff, he does make me interested in learning more about the historical influences. And I'm very grateful to Max Garfield for his resources about that. Because when you learn, for example, that Beethoven's Ninth was written when he was completely deaf, and you learn some of the history behind that, or if you learn more about the history of the symphony and how innovative it was, what he did with the structure of that symphony, then you start to appreciate it on another level. So I feel like Kay's books are like that for me. It's like the more I feel like the same way as you probably, Bridger. If I wish I were more like Jake in my early 20s. I think I probably would have enjoyed him, but I think that Jake is probably grasping more things than I would have at that age. I think that knowing a little bit more about what, or having a greater understanding of the fantasy genre, makes me appreciate what Kay's doing all the more. And still, I feel like they're such immersive, entertaining reads at the same time. It's like, do you want action and adventure and romance? It's all here. But do you want depth and historical influence and challenging questions and themes? It's all here too. And in a standalone, that's pretty remarkable to me.
All right, Jake, as the non-artist, your opportunity to be the Philistine in the group.
So this is where I'm like, I like the part where the armies fight each other.
But that's all fun. Like, that's the amazing thing about Kay's books is that there are so many ways to enjoy his books, in my opinion.
I mean, I think so. I don't participate that much in manga, but obviously, as someone who like reads a lot, I could appreciate the art other people make. And I think it's a huge part of like the cultural identity that a lot of characters have, and that an identity of who they are as people. Like a lot of people, like in real life, it's hard to, I think, imagine a world where like we're completely disconnected from other art. It's generally a huge part of who we are, and it influences who we are and our life. And kind of like what Max said, a reoccurring theme is those who don't think it's important. This is huge in Our Bone, as Blaze kind of has that arc of kind of like, what's the point of this? This is frivolous. And I think the reoccurring artist characters in his book is kind of him showing it isn't frivolous, like it's important, it's valuable, even if like its benefits might not be like objective. And I don't know.
That's a really good point. It seems to me like Blaze has a revelation in A Song for Our Bone in a way that Erlaine does.
Yeah,
Erlaine being
Jake,
the sorcerer.
Yeah.
Jake, I agree. I thought you said that very well. I mean, art is to a large extent what makes us human. I mean, it's an expression of our humanity, of our creativity, of our, putting into either visual or, audio, whatever the adverb I'm looking for, form, emotions. I mean, it's an expression of emotion in an artistic form. I mean, just whether it's a painting, whether it's song, whether it's poetry, whether it's music, whether all of these things express, encapsulate, transform human feelings, human vitality. I mean, and Kay gets it because all of his stories have it. or at least just about all of them. I'm trying to remember if The Last Light of the Sun does or not, but just about all of them, if not all of them, have art as a central theme there. But in Tigana, he uses it also in very specific ways, I think. I mean, he uses music as a form of escape for some of the characters. I mean, you have characters literally escaping from their pasts and joining a troupe of singers. I mean, it is very much a form of escape. It's a form of camouflage for some. Now, it can be both literal camouflage, but it can also be figurative camouflage. I mean, it's literal camouflage because some of the characters are literally hiding in a troupe of musicians. I mean, it's their false identities. But at the same time, it's also used as camouflage in some cases to hide their true feelings. You know, they're expressing things maybe not exactly in ways that they really feel. And, you know, art can do that at times. It's a form of communication, but sometimes it's a coded form of communication. And in fact, they use it as code at times in this novel. I mean, what is it? The tune, the lullaby from Tigana that is a symbol. I mean, it's a signal to other Tiganese that, hey, I'm one of you. If you recognize the tune, then we are, you know, part of this tribe. So there's coding that gets built into it. I mean, he's using it in all these different ways to convey different ideas and different ways that we communicate with one another, different ways that we relate to one another. And Tigana is not alone. I mean, he does this in all of his novels, which I just find fascinating.
Including Last Light of the Sun.
That is so true.
Okay, I couldn't remember whether he did or not. So I'm glad
I quote, chapter 2 starts with someone saying, "Our trouble is that we make good poems and bad siege weapons." I'm like, I like this person already.
Yeah. I love what you were saying about code, because that's true with the Cradle song. And there's also, I think, some...
the same thing.
Oh,
I did not see that comment before I said this.
There's also, I think, some commentary there about censorship too, with the way that they were trying to tackle all the poets from spreading messaging through that form. Really interesting.
Putting a message that, in a way that's subtle, but that other people might notice in a work of art, could come up in the Sarantine mosaic. I wonder. Probably not. Like, it's probably not going to come up again, and this is the last you'll see of it. But anyway,
I don't know. Mosaic is in the title.
I know. Obviously it comes up. I'm just
like
excited
a song for
Sarantine.
Arbonne. Well, I wonder if music plays into it.
Yeah. I'm just excited for more people to read Sarantine. Okay.
Yeah. Well,
I agree. I'm
excited to read it.
Fantastic.
I'm very, very excited to read that. Fantastic. So any closing thoughts? We'll hear some closing thoughts since we're already at 2 hours and 22 minutes. And I know we could talk on and on. This is just an incredible book. I feel like the more we talk about it, the more I'm like in awe of it, even though there were certain things I was not a fan of. And this book is mentioned, as we talked about as well. I still think that the strengths outweighed the weaknesses for me personally. So Jake Bishop, any final thoughts you want to give us?
I think I'll repeat my final thoughts from the lines of our song and A Song for Arbonne and go with "Man Writes Good." Yep.
Right.
I think it's Man Writes
Actually,
Well.
that was a deliberate. I'll have you know that was a deliberate artistic choice. And sometimes you have to be bold and do non-conventional things to really express your meaning and the truth of what you believe. So, Man Writes Good.
You're actually a beat poet, really.
Yeah,
so you are an artist.
I'm an artist because
Nice.
I'm an artist now. I just became one.
Nice.
That's funny. And what about you, Josh?
Yeah, I'll keep mine brief as well. I will just say that this is my 5th book by Gavriel, and last year, so within the last 12 to 18 months, I put out a video of my top 10 authors, and he's not only made my top 10 authors obsolete, I think he's made my top 3 authors obsolete. I mean, that's how high a regard I have for this author right now. I love how he makes me just slow down and hang on every word, because like Jake alluded to about 2 hours ago, you can read a sentence by him and it's just so well crafted and there's so much depth in there. I'm totally enamored by this author and I can't wait to read. Last Light of the Sun is the only one I have on the shelf right now, but Sarantine and everything else I haven't read, I will be reading over the next 2
A
years.
lot of people don't like Last Light as much. I love Last Light of the Sun. Like, I don't quite like it as much as some of the others, but I'm when you guys comment things like this, like I read them all, Jake, thanks to you. I know it's just like a standalone thing, but that really does mean a lot to me. So like that makes me happy when I see people comment that. So thank you for telling me that.
That's fantastic. I love it. Yeah.
Mac knows what's going on.
Yeah.
He's been on every one of these. He's just like, if I don't remember a factual thing, I'm like, Mac, we need answers.
I did not know that many of his books were free on Audible. That's good to know. And Bridger, any last thoughts you want to share?
This has been a wonderful discussion with the three of you, and I really appreciate getting the opportunity to participate. And I feel kind of like Jake does with respect to the impact that, at least I hope, that my earlier videos have had on readers. I mean, that was why I made those videos in the first place, was I felt like not nearly enough people were reading him, and in fact, in many cases, not even aware of him. And I wanted to rectify that. And I'm sure, Jake, you felt very much the same way, that here's an author who is so overlooked in a lot of the online discussion and deserves far more attention. And that's all I wanted to do with those videos, was shine a spotlight on him and hope that I could inspire people to pick up one or two or maybe all of his books over time.
I watched that first video not knowing it would be GGK, and it's just called like the greatest like living fantasy author. And when you said that you were going with Guy Gavriel K, I was like, yes, let's go.
I feel a little bit like, I'm an ambassador for him. I've never met the man. I admire his writing tremendously, and I just want people to know more about him and read his works. And to the extent that it certainly appears that there's a lot more online interest just on BookTube. People are reading more than just TIGANA. I'm glad they're reading TIGANA, but I really think they ought to read some of his others, because some of them are better, as I think we all agree here on this panel. Mm-hmm. And anyway, I'll leave it at that. It feels very gratifying that, at least in some small part, I might have contributed to that.
Yes. Well, we're all so grateful for your contributions, Bridger, and same to you, Jake. And I know, Josh, you're doing a lot to bring attention to GGK on your channel. Mm-hmm. So I'm really grateful to be part of this too, because part of this growing GGK fandom, because it really is exciting to have read 3 books by this author and to have so many emotions, so many thoughts, and know that there are so many books to read, so many more books to read from this author as well. So I just want to thank my 3 guests again for coming here and contributing so much to this discussion. I want to thank everyone in the chat. I'm sorry I did not get to every single comment, but really happy to see you all here. And I'm so glad to see that you all are loving Guy Gavriel K too. And if you haven't read TIGANA and you enjoy spoiler-filled discussions and you're here, well, thank you for watching. I hope you read TIGANA and some of K's other books. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us this afternoon, and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.